So that schism happened and divided the church into two big pieces. And the second schism happened 6 centuries after. And this is the schism between the Church of the West, Rome, and the Church of the East, Constantinople. The schism, which is formally counted from the 11th century, was not the first schism rupture in relations between the West and the East. The first division between the Western and Eastern churches occurred in the 5th century. It is called an Acacian schism. Acacian schism, after the name of the Patriarch of Constantinople, Acacius, who supported the policies of the Emperor Zeno. We only have a coin with the portrait of Zeno. Zeno was not supporting to Chalcedon. He wanted to diminish the importance of Chalcedon in order to reconcile with the non-Chalcedonian party. And he was supported by Patriarch Acacius of Constantinople, but the Pope of Rome, Felix, he was against. He wanted to protect Chalcedon. He wanted to enhance Chalcedon, and he broke relations with the Patriarch of Constantinople. He declared schism with the Church of the East. So the first schism between the West and the East was a kind of aftershock of the schism number one, of the schism over Chalcedon. But because there were no political preconditions for this schism, the empire was single still. The schism was not lasting for a long time. With the input of the emperors, it was healed eventually in 519. You see, this was the one single space. We have talked about this already, that the Roman space, Pax Romana, was a single space. And as far as it was single, it secured unity of the church. So the schism didn't happen mostly because there were no political preconditions for the schism between the Church of the East and the West. There were political preconditions for the schism between the Church of the Byzantine traditions and the Oriental churches because these parts were disputed by the Persian Empire and later on by the Arabs, Arab Caliphs. Okay. Is it clear? We will skip this. Not so important. The disputed territory, which became a precondition for the schism between the East and the West, was this one. So, the political preconditions for the division between the Church of the East and the West occurred when disputes emerged over some disputed territories, like this one. This is the territory which is called Eastern Illyria or Illyricum. The Greater Illyricum is this one, which includes Italy and modern Greece. And the eastern part of Illyricum was a disputed territory. Politically, after the Emperor Theodosius II made some administrative divisions between the Eastern administration and Western administration, administratively, this place was submitted to Constantinople, to the political rule of Constantinople. But ecclesially, it continued belonging to the Pope of Rome. So Rome exercised ecclesial authority over Illyricum, while politically it belonged to Constantinople. It's interesting that most Orthodox churches nowadays are here, and they are Eastern, but historically this territory belonged to Rome. And the dispute between Rome and Constantinople began with the political ambiguity of a territory. So territorial disputes, territorial disintegrity contributed to the division between the churches. Okay? This dispute exacerbated with the rise of the united political power in the West, with the Carolingian dynasty. Charles the Great, he had an ambition to restore a unified state in the West, in the western part of the former Roman Empire. That part was fallen under the barbarian attacks, was fragmented, and then Charlemagne restored it to a single state. And that state claimed imperial identity for itself. So the state of Charlemagne pretended to be an empire, which was a challenge to the Byzantine rulers, because the Byzantines considered themselves a Roman empire, and no one other empire could claim that identity for itself. And Charlemagne, he claimed this identity of the Western Empire for himself, and he was supported by the Pope of Rome in this claim. So the Pope confirmed and crowned Charlemagne actually as an emperor, a Western emperor. This caused a severe tension with the East. It's like we can have only one father or mother, right? And suddenly a person comes and he says, "I'm your father," and just because I have enough force and just because I like to be called your father, would you accept that? Well, that's exactly what the Byzantines felt about the tensions of Charlemagne. And this affected the churches. The churches jumped into the political controversy between the Carolingians and the Byzantines. This is the crown of Charlemagne, actually. The Charlemagne, in order to justify why his empire can claim Roman identity for itself, and why the Byzantine Empire is not Roman Empire, produced several arguments. One of them was theological. Charlemagne employed a theological idea which was supported by some Christian groups in the West and in the East in the late antiquity. One of those ideas was that the Spirit, Holy Spirit in the Trinity, proceeds from the Father and from the Son. The general common orthodoxy of the time, confirmed by the First Ecumenical Council in Nicaea, stated that the Holy Spirit proceeds only from the Father, not from the Son. That was the creed of the Council of Nicaea. It stated like this, that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father. But there were theological opinions, which were expressed in Spain by some theologians in Byzantium, that we can say that the Spirit comes also from the Son, from the Father through the Son. In Latin, this formula is filioque. Marker again. I will just got it here. So this is filioque. Okay. Which means in Latin, and from the Son. This idea was particularly supported by Augustine in the West, but remained a theological opinion and interpretation of the Nicene orthodoxy, which stated that the Spirit comes only from the Father. Charles, he took this interpretation and developed into a kind of absolute doctrine. He said, no, we cannot say that the Spirit comes only from the Father. We must say that the Spirit comes also from the Son. So he took an interpretation and developed it into a dogma, a universal dogma, and he built his claims, political claims, on this formula. He said the Byzantines are wrong because they believe in the wrong way. Because the way how they believe is heretical. And this annuls their imperial status. The empire, the real, true Roman Empire can be only Orthodox, can only keep the true faith. If the empire fails to keep the true faith, it loses its imperial status. The same idea was for the Byzantines. That's why they cared about orthodoxy. They cared to have pure faith, because they realized that if we have pure faith, we can claim for ourselves the status of the Roman Empire. If we fail to protect orthodoxy of faith, we lose our imperial status. And Charles actually jumped on this assumption, and he developed this idea that filioque is the only orthodoxy, and if someone doesn't subscribe to this orthodoxy, he or she cannot claim imperial status. And at that time, as I mentioned, the empress was Irene, and Charles, in addition to his very sexist attitude to a woman in the imperial chair, added this theological idea about filioque. That's how filioque was introduced to the Roman Creed. And it is still kept in the Roman Church. However, the dialogue between the Orthodox and Catholics in this country, in the US, which discussed the issue of filioque, came to the conclusion that filioque is not an obligatory dogma. So those Catholics who don't want to observe filioque can drop it, and it's okay. So the Catholic bishops of the US agreed, which was actually the return to the original idea of the creed, because the original creed doesn't have filioque. Yeah.
So the belief that the Holy Spirit comes from the Son also is in the Catholic?
Well, the Catholics, again, no marker. Well, I will explain in words. For the Catholic Church, the dogma is that there is the Father, the Son who is born from the Father, and the Spirit who comes to proceed from the Father and from the Son. The Spirit is love between the Father and the Son. That's why love can be between two persons. It comes from both sides. That's why, and it's an Augustinian idea. That's why the Spirit comes from the Son as well. Okay? For the Oriental and Byzantine churches. It's not true. Okay, the Byzantine and Oriental churches, they keep their original version of the Nicene Creed, which states that the Spirit comes only from the Father, not from the Son. And this is a particular identity of the Spirit. The identity of the Son is to be born. The identity of the Spirit is to proceed. That is the interpretation of the Creed by the Byzantines. And they disagreed fundamentally on this with Rome. And the person who articulated these disagreements was Patriarch Photius of Constantinople. This guy, who is considered a saint in the Byzantine Church, but he is a heretic for the Catholic. Okay? Photius emphasized not just filioque. He emphasized some other things as important for integrity of the Church. He said that for the Church to preserve its unity, it should meet three criteria. First, interpretation of primacy. He rejected the way how his contemporary Western Church interpreted primacy. The interpretation of primacy in the West was like that we impose on you what we want. You should follow what we say. Photius rejected this kind of primacy and he called it tyranny. The second thing is doctrine. He rejected filioque, the creed with filioque. And he said, we cannot accept even primacy if this primacy is combined with filioque. And he also rejected Western rites, which is an ambiguous rejection. He actually contradicted himself because in some writings he accepted plurality of rites in the Church. In other letters he rejected plurality of rites, particularly the Western and the Eastern rite. So these two issues remain important for the Catholic and Orthodox Church in their dialogue still. So we are still discussing the issue of primacy. We have reached more or less consensus on the issues of doctrine, so that the Catholic Church does not insist anymore on filioque. And the Catholic Church admits that it is possible to use the Nicene Creed in both editions, with filioque and without filioque. And this, satisfies most of them. Okay? Is this clear? It's a bit difficult. Well, at least that's the Byzantine attitude, position regarding this. And in this regard, in this issue, the Byzantines and Orientals, they are on the same page. Okay? And the Nestorians. I already said this. For these reasons, Photius convoked in 867 a council which anathematized the Pope. At that time, Pope Nicholas I. Rome claimed primacy, its superior position over the East, on the basis of a document which is called Donatio Constantini, the donation of Constantine. The Roman Church held this document as genuine, as true, up to the end of the Middle Ages. Only in the period of Renaissance, some scholars doubted the authenticity of this document. And indeed, the scholarship has proven that this document has been forged in the 8th century. The document is a story that Emperor Constantine in the 4th century was ill with lepra, and he was healed by the Pope of Rome, Sylvester. And in writing to go, Constantine gave the Pope right to rule over political figures in the Roman Empire, to be the key political figure in the West, and to rule, to command other Eastern patriarchs. So the Rome presented these documents to the Eastern and said, you see, your emperor confirmed our rights over you. It was like with the monastery of Sinai, who presents these documents from Muhammad, that Muhammad, as it were, to promise to protect this monastery. This document is not true. But still, it works. This document was rejected in the East. They said, no, this is not a genuine document, it's forgery. And it is so. Actually, the Roman Church used this document to overrule the political principles in the West. There was a problem that the political figures like princes in the West, in the Carolingian times, they exercised excessive political power over the church. They installed bishops, they commanded who to be the next pope, and so forth. And the Roman Church, particularly under Pope Gregory VII, tried to reverse this rule and to liberate itself from the political rule of the local authorities. And they used the Donatio Constantini, the Constantinian donation, to prove that it is the right of the Roman bishop to, for instance, to interdict a local political authority, a prince in France or in Britain. And then they also used this document to impose their will on the East. This is Pope Gregory. It happened that at that time, the Patriarch of Constantinople was another strong political figure with very strong political aspirations. His name was Michael Kerularios. He was a patriarch with a very weak emperor, Emperor Michael Stratioticus. The patriarch was strong, and he, you cannot imagine, he even dared to wear this stuff, the purple shoes, which was an embarrassment, because by law, by the Byzantine law, only the emperor could wear anything in purple, anything, even a handkerchief. To wear a purple shoe was really, something. And he dared to. This was an indication of his political ambition, that he wanted to become a political figure. And on the one hand, we have popes with very strong political agenda in the West, and we have a patriarch with also very strong political expectation, and they clash with each other, and they actually anathematize each other, which happened in 1054. 1054 is the year when officially the schism between the West and the East occurred. 1 minute. This schism was personal. It was between two personalities, the Patriarch of Constantinople and the Pope of Rome. Last time we were talking about the history and some historical reasons for the division between the Church of the East and the Church of the West. The reasons that emerged during the first millennium of Christianity, how different political platforms contributed to the division of the churches, how theological issues also enhanced the divisions, what were the historical circumstances, the arrogance, political aspirations of both political and ecclesial leaders, who coincided to be ambitious at the same time, and they actually blasted the church out and divided it pieces, and still there are two pieces of Christianity. And the rule of divisions is very simple. It's very easy to divide the church, but it's very hard to bring the pieces back again. It's very hard to reconcile the church, hard to overcome schisms. And history proves it was very easy to divide the church, and still it is impossible to do as one church for the churches in the East and in the West. Now we are going to discuss the issues that are still on the agenda of the Eastern and Western churches in their dialogue. The two issues which are mostly discussed in the official dialogue are the primacy and unity. The two documents that we are going to discuss next Thursday are about these two issues. That's why we're going to have a conversation of those two papers, because they exactly address two most burning issues of the dialogue, which are still unresolved. And it's hard to resolve them for the reasons that we are going to discuss. These issues are discussed in the framework of the official dialogue. It's a big event, always, so that there is a commission from the Catholic side appointed by the Pope and consistent of theologians from different countries who come. They even have one woman as a High-Tire, a theologian from Germany, a scholar in Christology. And each Orthodox church, because Orthodox churches are independent, autocephalous, independent from each other, so that each church appoints its own members to the dialogue. Okay? So this group one, on the one side, the Catholic side, there is a group of theologians and bishops who participate, who are appointed by the Pope, and who participate in the dialogue. On the other side, the members of the churches actually used to be on this dialogue on behalf of the Russian Church. And this is probably the most important forum of the East-West relationship between Eastern and Western churches. That's why every document is extremely important that comes from the dialogue. That document means that there is more or less a consensus among the churches regarding the issues. And that's why sometimes it's almost impossible to reach a consensus in such dialogues, because privately we can agree as private persons, as theologians, when we meet over a cup of coffee or a glass of whiskey and discuss theological issues, no problem. When it comes to the official session, the problems begin. We cannot speak then on our own behalf, but we represent our churches and are accountable to the churches. Okay? So let us see what is the nature of the difference between the Orthodox and Catholic positions regarding the issue of primacy. It is still impossible for us to arrive at a common interpretation of what primacy is. The situation is even more difficult that there is a Catholic consensus, more or less, about what is primacy. Still, it is not so firm, because, again, privately, over a glass of whiskey, Catholic theologians can doubt the official doctrine. We say, well, we understand that's how it works, but we don't necessarily agree with this, especially the Jesuits agree with that. But when it comes to the official position, the Catholic side is always unanimous, always in agreement. As for the Orthodox, it is much harder because we, the Orthodox, cannot agree among ourselves what is primacy. The only thing regarding primacy that we can agree upon is that it should not be Catholic kind of primacy. And then after this point, we cannot agree on anything. That is the most difficult part of the dialogue, which does not help our conversation with the Catholic side either. Okay? I don't know how to make it more visible to you. Should we again put down the screens in the back? Or it's okay with this light? What would you say? Yeah, the lights. Good. Good idea. Is it better? Yeah. Okay. The solution was much easier. We should invite you to the dialogues. Right. That's what I've just said. The primacy, as it is interpreted by the Catholic side, is intrinsically contrary to some principal basics of the, excuse me for my, call it pleonasm, really basic things which are pertinent to the Orthodox tradition. First, it is incompatible with the idea of sovereignty of the Orthodox churches. We arrive on the idea of sovereignty. It's like with the states. You cannot imagine an independent state to yield, to submit itself to another political center and to delegate its sovereignty to that political center. That would mean dissolution of the state. Right? That's what happened with the churches, many churches in the West. Some churches in the West, like in France or in North Africa, they had the same kind of sovereignty in the first millennium, in the first centuries, that the Eastern churches have now. But then, with the growth of the authority of Rome, that sovereignty was sacrificed, actually, to the unity of the Western Church. No Eastern Church can sacrifice its own sovereignty to any center, any other center. This applies to the Orthodox family. There is no at all will, desire for the Orthodox Church, say, to submit themselves to the authority of the Church of Constantinople, which is regarded as the first church among the Orthodox churches. No desire, even more a lack of desire to submit themselves to the authority of Rome. So sovereignty and primacy are incompatible, at least at this stage, as regards the dialogue. Yes? Excuse me, I didn't hear you. Yes. Oh, I didn't get it, sorry.
So can you briefly go over, I'm still not understanding.
Yes, we were discussing this, the primacy. Primacy is when the church, a particular church, a local church, like the Church of Rome or the Church of Constantinople, arranges the matters of other churches and imposes a certain coherence or policy upon other churches. Say, me as a church of, Los Angeles, I want to do certain things. But someone comes and says, no, you cannot do this. Do what I say. That's more or less how primacy works. It doesn't mean that primacy is often abused. No, it was quite often abused in the Middle Ages, but in the modern era, it's not like that. There are still abuses of primacy, but people who are in the position at the first church, they are careful enough not to overuse their authority. Then the second issue is consensuality of the relationship between the churches. It's like almost like the relations between humans. You cannot be cursive. You cannot be violent against another person. The same is with the churches. If the churches want to stay together, at least from the Eastern perspective, their consensus should be consensual. Their relationship should be consensual. Even if there is a primate, the first church, like the Church of Constantinople, the Church of Constantinople should explain the other churches the necessity, why they should do something. The Church of Constantinople cannot impose its will on other churches. And that is the essential difference between the idea of primacy in the East and in the West. Because in the West, primacy is not consensual. So no one can say no to Rome. Of course, Rome tries to be careful enough not to provoke resistance. It puts the things in the way that other churches would say yes all the time. But again, there is always a possibility of imposing a will which makes impossible for any local church to say no to Rome. Okay? So that is the difference, the essential difference between the structure of the Western Church with the Pope as the primate and the Eastern churches, where there are too many popes and there is no one single person who could impose his will upon other churches. And you cannot resolve it. So Rome insists that this is the only way how we can exercise primacy. And the East says, no, it doesn't work for us. We cannot do like that. We can only do something when we agree. So we yield to something when we accept the will. The will of the other church cannot be imposed upon us. Well, this causes a lot of problems in the relations between the Eastern churches, because if you have over a dozen churches, you can hardly secure agreement among them. Even if you have, if you are two persons, and it's very hard to achieve an agreement, and if you have such a big family as 14 or 15 churches, it's very hard to achieve agreement. But this is the only way to work through consensus, to try to achieve consensus, not to impose one's central will upon other churches. Okay. Is it clear? Yeah? It works very well, this analogy with the human relations, I think. Right? Like that. And the third issue that we cannot agree upon is how we interpret primacy. Whether primacy is something like divine, given from God, or it's something that emerged in the history as a matter of convenience of the churches. Was it just suitable, comfortable for the church to agree to have a church which would be the first among them? Or it is something that God wants about the church, that God has embedded into the church. That is a principal disagreement, again, between the Eastern and the Western churches. Because for the Catholic Church, primacy is jus divinum, is the divine law. It's something which is innate in the church, which is an intrinsic part of the church. Without it, the church cannot be a church. For the East, primacy is okay, but it is interpreted not as something given from God, but as something that we have agreed upon. It was just convenient for us to have someone to moderate the churches. And that's why we embarked upon primacy. Is this clear? Yeah.
Would the first primate have been St. Peter? So would we?
Yeah, we're going to discuss it right now. Exactly. Yes, a very good point. So that's what I've just said. Yes. The Catholic Church builds its idea of primacy on the Gospel's words from Matthew 16, when Christ said to Peter, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." There is a huge literature beginning from the late antiquity that elaborated on this phrase, in the sense that this phrase is the confirmation of primacy of Peter among the apostles, and consequently the primacy of the Roman Church, which was established allegedly by Peter among other churches. This hermeneutics has its own historical background. Remember, when we were talking about the relations between the East and the West, we were referring to Eastern Illyricum. This is the piece of Europe where now Greece is, like Serbia, Albania, parts of Bulgaria, parts of Hungary. That was a piece, a controversial piece, a subject of arguments, controversy between the East and the West. Politically, originally, this piece of Europe, of the Roman Empire, belonged to Rome and was administered by Rome, politically. Also, because it had been a part of the Roman part of the Roman Empire, the western part of the Roman Empire, it came to be managed by the Church of Rome as well. So this was a Catholic, to put it in modern terms, territory. Okay? Then, after the division of the empire, in the end of the 4th century, this piece politically was subjected to Constantinople. It became a part of the Eastern Empire, right? But ecclesially, in the terms of the church, it still belonged to the Church of Rome. So it adopted a double jurisdiction. The political jurisdiction was Eastern, and the ecclesial jurisdiction was Western. That's why in the 5th century, soon after this transformation happened, Pope Boniface I made one of the earliest claims over this particular territory, based on the words of Jesus to Peter. So that is one of the earliest instances of this kind of hermeneutics of the words of Peter. They were applied for a very particular political reason. And the reason was here. Okay? During the centuries, this territory was always a disputable territory. There was always an argument between the Church of East and West over the Eastern Illyricum. On the basis of the historical precedents, for instance, the Church of Rome considered this territory as its own missionary territory. That's why it sent its missionaries to Bulgaria when Bulgaria decided to adopt Christianity. The emperors violently transferred this territory, not only politically but ecclesially, to the jurisdiction of Constantinople. So in the early Middle Ages, this territory was forcefully and unjustly taken from the Western Church and joined the Eastern Church. This was disputed by the East, so by the West, by Rome, and Rome had its own reasons to be unhappy with Constantinople, with the Church of Constantinople, because the Church of Constantinople, together with the Emperor, actually took this territory from the jurisdiction of Rome. On the 40s, it caused, the controversy only increased and the tensions only increased, and eventually this led to this contributed to the division. It was probably one of the most important political input, this disputable territory, to the division between the churches of the East and the West. So, again, the praise of Christ to Peter was used regarding this territory to justify claims of Rome over Eastern Illyricum. And it was interpreted exactly in this way, that Christ, when he was talking to Peter, he meant him personally as the rock upon which Christ wanted to build his church. So in this interpretation, which began from Boniface in the 5th century, the personality of the Apostle Peter was presented as the rock upon which Christ built his church. But from the Eastern perspective, Eastern hermeneutics, it was not the personality of Peter, but his words, his confession, that you are Christ, you are true God, that Peter said, these words are the rock upon which the church is built. Not Peter himself personally, but his confession. That was the Eastern hermeneutics of the words. And that's why the East disagreed with the Western interpretation of these words. And again, you need to have a chain. These words of Christ to Peter, that you are the rock. Another piece of this chain is the assumption that Peter was the founder of the Roman Church. From the Eastern perspective, it was not only Peter, but Paul also was a co-founder of the Western Church. And in early Eastern interpretations of the origins of the Roman Church, both Peter and Paul were regarded as founders of the Church of Rome, and it began very early, from the 2nd, 3rd century. So, from the Eastern perspective at least, all this chain of logical arguments that led from this phrase of Christ to primacy of Rome was disputable. Okay? Is this clear? So we skip this. And we continue with the evolution of the idea of primacy. So it began with the region of Illyricum in Europe. And it developed to something bigger. It developed to the idea of the universal jurisdiction of the Western Church, to the idea that the Bishop of Rome has authority, has jurisdiction over the entire universal church. Which means that even though some churches in the East, like Constantinople or Alexandria or Antioch, do not recognize authority of Rome over them, it is still there. And it is from God. It is God's will that the Church of Rome has universal authority over the East. And it's just a matter of time when the churches would recognize this universal authority. This idea was completely rejected in the East. They just completely disagreed with the idea of universal authority of the Church of Rome from the beginning. And this idea, the idea of the universal church, it became clearly articulated in the Middle Ages, in the age of scholasticism. Because scholasticism, using Aristotle, this guy, developed the idea, the distinction between the universal and particular as categories applicable to everything in the world. This is a basic distinction, the distinction between the universal and particular. This is the basic distinction in the logics of Aristotle, in his dialectical philosophy. I have explained to you a bit already how it works. We can take a table, this table, that table, this table. These are particular tables. But what they share is tableness, the common nature of table. So this distinction between the universal and particular works for tables, for people, for God, and for the church. Interpreted in these terms, the Church of Christ, the Universal Church of Christ, was identified in the West with the Church of Rome. From the Eastern perspective, this was unacceptable. From the Eastern perspective, the Church of Rome was and still is a local church, a particular church. There is no visible universal church. The church that we can touch, that we can feel, that we can see is only a local church. We cannot feel, touch, and see a universal church. As we cannot feel, see, and touch a universal tableness. We can only feel, touch a particular table, not a universal tableness. The same is with the churches. We cannot see the universal church. That's why the Roman Church cannot be universal, as there cannot be a universal table. That is the Eastern logic, the Eastern argumentation against the primacy. Okay, is this clear? Any question? Great, you've got Aristotle immediately. For the students in the late antiquity, it took 2 or 3 years to go through this and to understand this idea. It was actually the basis of the curriculum. That's how they began their education. They began education with understanding the difference between the universal and particular, according to Aristotle. The claims, the universal claims of papacy culminated in the Middle Ages. We have already mentioned the developments in this period, how the primacy became really, the most important, the most discussed and yet the most important idea in the time. It applied to everything, the primacy of Rome. It applied to the political sphere. It applied to the structures of the churches. And it also applied to the self-awareness of Christians. So that a particular person, a layman, could not stay away of these discussions of primacy because these discussions affected this person immediately. Because it translated into the idea of salvation of human being. The most important thing for a medieval person was to save his or her soul. Well, it is still the most important thing for the Christian. But it was really a public concern, a private concern, everything, any concern for the medieval society. That's why the idea of primacy penetrated, employed this concept of salvation, and was articulated in the bulla promulgated by Pope Boniface, another Boniface, now 8th. That one was 1st, and this one is 8th. In the 13th century, well, actually it was beginning of the 14th century, and which stated, we declare, we proclaim, we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff.
How close in time was this to the time of indulgences in Catholic?
Well, the indulgences flourished a bit later. They flourished actually after the Crusades. And this was just the period of Crusades. And they're connected certainly, because it is the Pope who could delegate indulgences through with the priests. You know that even the Orthodox have indulgences in the East, in Greece particularly. I found some testimonies, some documents that you can read them as similar to the indulgences in the West. Like, if you do something, I dispense you, and you are free of sins, and so forth. So I found such documents in Greece, and they were quite recent, 18th, 19th century. Yeah, I was surprised myself. But this statement was even stronger. It meant that if you are hopeful to save your soul, then you must submit to the primacy of Rome. You must accept the primacy of Rome. If you don't accept the primacy of the Bishop of Rome, you are condemned, definitely. No chance. Okay? That was a very strong statement. And certainly the East would never accept such a statement. That would be a blasphemy for the East. And this was one of the reasons of tensions between the exacerbating, the increasing tensions between the East and West. So we see the trajectory, the evolution of primacy from Boniface I, who claimed Eastern Illyricum for the Church of Rome, to Boniface VIII, who claimed all human souls for the primacy. A very dramatic development, isn't it? This led to the idea of papacy as a divine institution and as something which is given, granted from God. That God gave papacy to the humanity as God's greatest gift. This idea was articulated in particular by Thomas Cajetan in the 15th century, just in the time of the Reformation. He is a saint in the Catholic Church, and he in particular said the authority of the Pope is immediately from God and revealed in sacred scripture. That is his words. So that's when approximately the idea of divine character, divine nature of primacy was articulated. For the Catholic side of the dialogue, they say it was always like that. The Easterners say, no, it was not always like that. In the early centuries, the primacy of the Roman Church was interpreted differently, not as a divine nature, but as a matter of convenience, as a matter of acceptance. It existed only because it was accepted by other churches, not because it was imposed from God. Okay? That is a difference in the interpretation. It's like in the marriage, a husband can say, I am your husband because I am given to you from God. And the wife can say, no, you are my husband because I accepted you as husband. That's essentially the logics. Both logics work, especially the first logic was pretty much spread in before our age. In the 20th century, there were attempts to reinterpret primacy, because the primacy as it was articulated by people like Cajetan did not work anymore. People would not accept this way of seeing primacy. And some brilliant Catholic theologians who belonged to the movement which was called Nouvelle Théologie, which was born in France in the 30s and flourished before Vatican II, they re-articulated primacy and put it in a much nicer and more acceptable way for modern people, modern understanding one of them, like Hans Urs von Balthasar, a prominent Catholic theologian, he tried to interpret primacy in a more consensual way. So coercion and consent became the crucial criteria of judging ecclesial things, ecclesial phenomena. What happened in the church? Is it acceptable from the perspective of consensual acceptance, or it is not acceptable because it is coerced? That's why they try to interpret primacy in these terms, and he in particular said, the office of Peter is one of several indispensable elements in the ecclesiastical structure, thus freeing it from the pyramid-like isolation to which it consented, partially involuntarily, by permitting itself to be modeled on the pattern of imperial Rome, and partially voluntarily in reaction to the encroachments of medieval emperors. So there was a recognition that certainly some political structures underpin the theology of primacy in the Middle Ages. And we in the East believe that they indeed did so. There was a political substructure that actually conditioned the way how primacy was interpreted in theology. Okay? Is this clear? Well, some people disagree even with this interpretation. Another prominent Catholic theologian who still lives, he's a Swiss, probably you've heard of him, Hans Küng, he's quite a prominent figure. A Catholic priest. He disagrees even with this compromising interpretation of primacy. He says primacy does not belong to the church, at least the primacy as a universal category, the primacy in the sense that the Roman Church is universal. He says it is just a historical convenience, it occurred for certain historical reasons, but it doesn't belong to the church. He was actually a close friend of Joseph Ratzinger, and they were together in Tübingen, at the University of Tübingen. And it's interesting, there are stories about them, really funny. Küng, at the time, it was the 60s, he rode a luxury car to Tübingen. It's quite difficult because Tübingen has narrow streets. And Ratzinger was riding his bike. And they competed in different ways in theology and in the means of transportation. And eventually Ratzinger became a pope, and Küng became almost convinced as a theologian. He actually was banned from teaching in the university, Catholic faculty of the university. Now he recently wrote a letter to Francis, which was apprehended, which was well received by Francis, with his own points, and he insists that we should need to reform papacy radically. He promotes the thesis of Reformation that the Church is semper reformanda. The Church is always needs to be reformed. When the Church reforms itself, it is the Church. It becomes the Church. When it stagnates without reforms, it ceases to be the Church. The positions of the points of Küng is quite close to some Eastern positions regarding particularly the essence of primacy. So he disagrees with the idea that primacy is a use divinum. It's a divine institution, and he insists that it is just a matter and emerged for historical. Okay, is this clear? Any question, guys? Okay, let us proceed. So as I said, in the East, from early centuries, this interpretation of primacy as it emerged in the West was rejected. And there were some protagonists of the rejection, like the one that we have already seen, Patriarch Photius of Constantinople, this guy. He is a kind of key saint for the Byzantine churches, but he is considered to be a heretic for the Catholic Church. Photius actually was accepting primacy under certain conditions, and one of those conditions was that the primacy should not be interpreted as a universal category, as the universal church, and that the primacy is not a divine institution in the church. It is just a matter of convenience why it is emerged. An example of the Eastern attitude to primacy is this canon 28 of the Council of Chalcedon. Remember, it was probably the most important ecumenical council of the common church, which was accepted by both the Eastern and the Western church, except that the Western church did not accept this canon 28. And this canon 28, it states, I don't know if you can read, the fathers rightly accorded prerogatives to the see of older Rome, since that is an imperial city. That is the crucial phrase. So the prerogatives of the see of Rome exist because it was an imperial city, not because Peter was there, not because God gave primacy to the Bishop of Rome, but because there were emperors living. They didn't like Rome, actually. At the time, the secret is that the Roman emperors didn't like Rome. They tried to stay away and find different places outside, because Rome still preserved some democratic institutions like Senate, and they were bothering the emperors. But again, because there was a Senate, because there were imperial structures, institutions, this made the Church of Rome first. That is the idea behind this canon 28 of Chalcedon. And then it continues that the fathers were moved by the same purpose, and the 150 most devout bishops appointed equal prerogatives to the most holy see of New Rome, which is Constantinople, reasonably judging that the city, which is honored by the imperial power and senate, and enjoying privileges equaling older Rome, should also be elevated to her level in ecclesiastical affairs and take second place after her. So Constantinople was elevated to the second position for the same reasons for which the first Rome itself became the first church, because it was an imperial city and because the Senate and the emperor resided there. Okay? Yes?
So they're saying that Constantinople is equal to Rome, but then they're saying, but no, you get the second position.
Yeah. That is the Eastern way of putting things. Yes, but no. Constantinople was equal in the sense of there were two first churches. They were regarded as two first churches, but Rome was more firstly than Constantinople. It translated into several details. For instance, the churches who disagreed with the judgments of Constantinople, they could appeal to Constantinople. Say, a church in Asia Minor had an issue, and in order to solve that issue, it appealed to Constantinople. When this church didn't like how Constantinople handled this issue, it could also appeal to Rome. And Rome would be the last instance, the last institution to judge. So, in terms of judgment of the court system, say, the Church of Rome was the highest appeal court. Okay? But not many other things would be different for them. It's interesting that this canon 28, even though the Council of Chalcedon, as I said, and we have considered it earlier, it articulated its articles of faith with the contribution of the Church of the West. Pope Leo the Great insisted that the Council of Chalcedon adopted the language of two natures of Christ, and the Council adopted that language. But this canon, which was adopted equally with other definitions and canons, was not accepted by Rome until Rome, during the Fourth Crusade, captured Constantinople and installed its own patriarchy and its own Latin emperor in Constantinople. Then only they adopted Canon 28 because it served them in the 13th century. Another example, another theologian who lived in the 14th century, quite late. That was the period when already the Church of the East departed from the Church of West, or the other way around. It depends how you see it. He explained why the claims of the Church of Rome are unacceptable in the East. And the reasons are exactly what I have indicated. I quote, "The Pope has indeed two privileges. He is the Bishop of Rome, and he is the first among the bishops." So there is an acknowledgement that the Pope of Rome is the first. But, yes, and he continues, "From Peter, he has received the Roman episcopacy. As to the primacy, he received it much later from the Blessed Fathers and the pious emperors." So he recognizes that Peter was indeed the founder of the Church of Rome, but the bishops of Rome received their privileges, primacy, later on under political conditions because they were located in the most important city of the Roman Empire. So, for it was just that ecclesiastical affairs be accomplished in order. So, just to serve the convenience of the church, not because it was given from God. That is the idea of the eastern part of the equation, and it was articulated in the 14th century. Well, I would argue that the primacy as it is emerged in the Middle Ages has not just a political underpinning, it has a strong philosophical underpinning, which stems from Neoplatonism. Neoplatonism is crucially important for the Eastern thinking. It's a kind of matrix of thinking for the Eastern theology. And you cannot understand Eastern theology without diving into Neoplatonism. And there is a scheme, Neoplatonic scheme, behind the idea of primacy. That is, that is more or less the primacy, how it works in theology when primacy is considered as a divine thing, as a divine institution. Primacy exists on three levels: the level of the universal church, the level of regional church, and the level of local church community. There is always a primate on each level. On the universal level, according to the Catholic interpretation, it's Pope. Here, on the regional level, they are patriarchs, or metropolitans sometimes. On the level of communities, they are like bishops or priests. Okay? And this structure, this pyramid, it stems from the pyramid of the divine. Say, in the Trinity, Father is the only without beginning. The Son and the Holy Spirit, they have beginning. The Father, that's why the proponents of this theology, they build a scheme of monarchy in the Trinity. There's the Father, the Son below, and the Holy Spirit below, because they come from the Father. The same is with Christ and the Church. Christ is the head of the Church. He's at the top. And they constitute a kind of model for primacy for the universal church, regional church, and the local church. This scheme is surprisingly the same with the structure of being constructed by a Neoplatonic philosopher of the 5th century, Proclus. This is his structure of being. It's more complicated than this one. But essentially, it is the same, that there is as a layer in the being which belongs to divinity. Proclus was not Christian, he was anti-Christian. But he certainly he developed a theology where he included into the structural being some kind of deity, which he called, as a Neoplatonist, he called it the One. And he claimed that on every layer of being, the being itself, life, intellect, soul nature, and material world, they are the layers of beings. There is the reflections of the One. There is something which represents the One and which is the first among equals on each level. So that is a philosophical scheme underpinning which was imported to Christianity through Dionysius the Areopagite, or Pseudo-Dionysius, a guy, we don't know his real name. He lived in the 5th, 6th century and in Syria, and he influenced tremendously the way of thinking. He introduced actually the principle of hierarchy to the church. He actually coined the word hierarchy. It was coined by Dionysius and was introduced to other languages. And he built his concept of hierarchy on the Neoplatonic